Digital Diplomacy series. Okay. We'll start right away. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mariangela Zappia, the Italian ambassador to the United States. You have the floor.
So, welcome to all of you. It's great to have you here at the embassy. This is the 12th year in a row of our series, so we are really very happy. And before we start, I just would like to remind us that today we celebrate International Human Rights Day. It's an important day for democracies like we are, for Italy and the US, countries that put foreign human rights at the core of their foreign policy, protection of human rights worldwide. So just a minute to think about that. And 2024 has been a very peculiar year with a global election super cycle and over 70 countries going to the polls, including, of course, the 27 members of the European Union, which voted for the new European Parliament, and, of course, the United States. So 2024 represented a sort of true case study to serve as the basis for our discussion today, focus around influence, information, and disinformation. It's not just about technology and social media, nor about media as such or content creators, neither about the role of artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence per se. 2024 has been about how we, all of us, younger, less young, consume information online and offline, how we scroll through the noise, who we trust and why, who we should trust and who we shouldn't. 2024 has deepened and pushed in new direction the conversation around how and why voters engage with politics, government, and the institutions they are represented by. A conversation that is part of a broader one about how we keep our democracies not only alive, but healthy. As I was saying before, we started this conversation, this digital diplomacy series in 2012. It has grown to be a lively and participated, as you can see from this room, public forum to discuss the intersection of technology and diplomacy. Our objectives has never been to provide answers, but to spark conversations and allow us in the diplomatic community and beyond to better understand the world around us and some of the most pressing topics around technology. Most recently, for example, we discussed the power this power of artificial intelligence in the framework of our presidency of the G7. This was one of the priority topics. And I want to quote our Prime Minister Meloni, who pointed out that artificial intelligence is nothing more than a great multiplier. And if that is the case, if it's a great multiplier, the question we must ask ourselves is what do we want to multiply? What do we want artificial intelligence to multiply? And understand that is really at the core of how we want to use artificial intelligence. This is, I think, one of the questions that we are asking here today. What do we want technology, including artificial intelligence, to multiply when it comes to elections, electoral campaigns, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges to overcome. I'm sure that my friend Steve Clemons and our panel today will guide us in a much needed discussion around this very topic. And to Steve, really grazie mille per essere qui. first of all, for being such a good friend of the embassy and me personally through the years. And thank you also for helping us in shaping the discussion this evening. I know that Steve sometimes can be, how can I say, a little bit provocative. We expect that. The panel is going to be for sure more interesting thanks to you and to your keynote speech that will start the conversation. Grazie to Adrienne Lafrance of The Atlantic, to all our panelists today. Some are veterans of our digital diplomacy series: Leah Haberman, Elise Labot, and Aaron Parnas. A very special thanks to Gianni. I don't know if Gianni Riotta is following us right now. He's connected. I don't see him. Oh, here you are. Gianni, ciao. Great to see you on the screen almost at midnight. But we know Gianni, he works
Buongiorno.
24 hours a day. So, but anyway, thank you really for being here. We are really grateful for your enthusiasm and your friendship. So with that, I think I will leave it to Steve to start the conversation. No, to you. You want to introduce it? Rightly so. Rightly so. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. It's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Clements, a veteran of Washington politics and diplomacy. I met him, you might not remember, I met him almost 10 years ago at the museum, which doesn't exist anymore. He spoke on stage right before me, and I was Star Trek. I still remember something he said back then, and I think something that it's still very true. The digital space is a vast universe. I'm paraphrasing, it's not the perfect quote. The digital space is a vast universe, cosmically large. We are still scratching its surface. And again, I think it's still very true today. He also said that the growth of the digital space has made DC less relevant. And again, I think it's very true today. We're happy to have you keynote our event today. Steve is a contributing editor at the National Interest and has served as editor-at-large of The Hill, The Atlantic, and Semaphore, as well as in senior editorial roles at National Journal and Quartz. He also co-chairs the US initiative of GlobeSec, one of Europe's most dynamic global security think tanks. He is the chairman and CEO of Whitehall LLC, a strategic communications and events firm that translates ideas into high traction impact. He organizes lots of events, like multiple a day. Tomorrow is one of the examples. Steve previously served as executive vice president of the Economic Strategy Institute at the New America Foundation. He was founding executive director of the Nixon Center, later renamed the Center for the National Interest. Steve, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Ambassador Zappia. I think Adrian was my boss. Were you my boss at one point? I think maybe for a little bit of an overlap, so it's great. I've been editor-at-large of like every publication in Washington, including National Journal, Quartz, Semaphore, The Hill. So if anybody needs an editor-at-large, I'm available. It's the best job. Look, I'm honored to be up here, and I have lots of thoughts, and they're very disjointed, I think, much like media today. I have a lot of different views of this very important topic. So many things are going on right now, one of which I just got off a plane yesterday, flying back from the Doha Forum via Dubai, and who was on my plane but Ann Neuberger from the National Security Council, who's very involved in looking at the digital cyber world, cybersecurity. And she said, Steve, for the first time, we're going to, because of the rules we've helped set up in Europe, hear from social media platforms and get data about what happened in Romania. Now, if you haven't followed, an election was just annulled by the Supreme Court in Romania over exactly the kinds of issues we're discussing here. And the fear that TikTok or other social media platforms were essentially infested by players, foreign malign interference that somehow impacted the vote and voters at a key time and led to an individual running it. Now, the question, as I said, is, There are a lot of really interesting questions about democracy, about choice, and who we are in this digital space. Are we guinea pigs or pigeons in a Skinner cage, where we are simply the function of algorithms that are hitting us, and the state has to protect us from those algorithms, or from watching Aaron Parnas on TikTok, or other malign issues? I have to tell you, I have very mixed feelings about this, because I see it is the responsibility of the state to help people learn how to think critically, how to process information in the world they're in, and to understand that orthodoxy can be dangerous. So we have somehow, and I know it's uncomfortable for people to say, I'm uncomfortable with what has happened in Romania, because you're basically saying that people who made a choice, even if they were deceived by media and whatnot, weren't able to do that. So I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for us. So one of the big things I think we need to ask ourselves in this world of social media algorithms and the power to turn an algorithm on. I may be wrong that in fact we all are guinea pigs that are functions of algorithms, and our behavior is easily manipulated, and the state needs to protect us from that. But I don't come from that world. I come from a world that fears orthodoxy, that fears those kind of controls, and would rather be on my own thinking things. So that's one element I wanted to put out there. The thing I was sort of most proud of in the media space, I was a think tank guy. I helped co-found the New America Foundation many years ago, and it was supposed to be a risk-taking think tank. We had conservatives, we had liberals. The idea was to bring on intellectuals that were going to take risks in this town and roll bowling balls into status quo thinking and try to do things differently. And I realized when I was in this space that I had some of the most bright and brilliant thinkers in America from across the political divide, and my job was to get them op-ed space in the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. We became the most published think tank in a very short period of time. And you realized, however, that op-ed pages in traditional media are still like intellectual cartels. They're controls. You get yeses and nos from editors. You don't know why they made the yes or no. And it just pissed me off. It just upset me regularly when I knew I had something brilliant and I wanted to break out of that cartel. And that's finally when my friend Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo, one of the earliest and most, I think, significant political blogs in the country, my friend Josh said, Steve, stop giving me all your good political, leaks that you're getting from government officials. You should start your own blog. So the Washington Note, which I started, came out of that period of time. And it's relevant to this discussion today because I very quickly saw that my competition was mainstream media. It was the legacy media back then in 2004, so 20 years ago. It was the New York Times, it was the Wall Street Journal, it was the Washington Post. It was these places out there that were largely homogenized. They were leaving really fascinating stories on the cutting room floor. One of the big issues at that time, George Bush had just won the presidency, much like we saw right now with Trump, and they controlled the House and the Senate and the White House. So they had Republican sweep in that election in 2005. And we had a lot of messy relations with the European Union, et cetera. And so we were having this fight about whether America was a unilateralist nation or working in a transatlantic divide. And so I remember George Bush got more hate mail than ever in my life when I praised George Bush for giving a principled speech about the importance of getting out of this unilateralist mode and begin engaging countries from around the world. The next thing he did is he nominated John Bolton for the United Nations, and it made me look like an idiot. And so I committed my blog to writing a daily story about John Bolton, whom I'd known for a long time. And he had a right-hand guy who was leaking, so I would get him drunk, and he would leak me stuff all the time. So I knew more about John Bolton than any person alive. And I'll never forget when Joe Biden, then Senator Biden, said, Steve, we would like to help you and support you, but he's an obscure bureaucrat going for a job no one cares about. That was the line. And what wasn't seen at that time was how a blog could divide Republicans that believed in principled American engagement in the world, and those that really didn't, that wanted to kind of come back. Now, it's ironic that John Bolton today is a principled internationalist all of a sudden, but at the time, my blog did that. And so every day, I was dominating the John Bolton story for 21 months, whereas the Washington Post, New York Times, Financial Times, all had writers that wanted to do what I was doing, but their editors wouldn't let them. And it showed that I was filling a gap. So when we think about new media, when we think about TikTok, I'm obsessed with Aaron Parnas. Aaron, stand up for a minute. You're gonna all see you in a second. I like this guy. Anybody watch him? I mean, I am on TikTok and I tell everybody, I'm not afraid of the Chinese. So I think he is a fantastic voice. He picks up other news. He sets up a context. I think Aaron is an example. I think Zivi Media, I think what Elise Labott is doing, the whole new younger generation of how they process thinking. This is a good thing, in my view, to rip the throat out of the traditional media. And it's happening anyways. You kind of look at the fact that right now, only 35% of adults follow news closely. That's down from 51% 8 years ago, 9 years ago. There's been a big shift, fragmentation. We have all sorts of new ways that people are absorbing and hearing their media. I start my morning usually with Aaron. I don't know what it is about the algorithm, but they feed it to me all the time. I get Aaron first, and then I get through quickly, except when you're too long in the things, and I just skip ahead. For some odd reason, Megyn Kelly, an odd challenge to my worldview, comes in and she's kind of talking about how Pete Hegseth is a good guy. So I'm somehow being challenged. I think it's important because sometimes algorithms feed you what you want to hear, and sometimes maybe it's just Elon Musk's influence. He's shoving Megyn Kelly stuff down my throat. I would rather not get it, but I mean, it's interesting to hear what's going on out there. I also seem to be on an algorithm in TikTok and social media for tigers, lions, and orcas. And these things come in, but I also learned about Syria. I learned about Luigi Mangione, tariffs, Blue Sky. I learned about Blue Sky from Aaron. I was sort of late to the game there. But I think in the process of all of this, you see a massive fragmentation of media. And the question is, if there's misinformation out there, if there are lies that are being promulgated, if they're being done at scale and with nations behind them, yes, I have a concern, but that's not most of what we're seeing. And the question is, in the world of social media and media, what is going on and what's coming next? I don't agree with Elon Musk that so-called citizen journalism is something to be proud of and elevate too much, because you lose expertise, you lose context, you lose history. But I will also say that those places that have context, expertise are doing a crappy job of somehow maintaining those audiences in a way to make them relevant to them. And I think we've somehow, some part of the blame in the deterioration of interest in the media lies with those legacy media. Now, when I was a blogger, the way the legacy media came in is they came in and bought most of us. I never sold out. I still own Washington Note. The Atlantic tried, but that's a whole nother story. But I kept it independent. But most of the blogs and most of the kind of big players at that time, all of a sudden you saw them having young bloggers. It helped them fill in the gaps a little bit. I think we need to do that. Aaron Parnas is going to end up being bought by somebody big. I know. I don't know. We'll see how long he lasts. He says, no, we'll see. We'll see. You can measure when we come back. But I want to lay out something else. I don't want to go on too long here. I just want to, provoke you with some things. I think in this space, particularly thinking about the Romanian elections, or this morning I moderated a session on disinformation with a gentleman named Marc-Antoine Brillant from France, who's the head of something called Viginum, which is a French agency responsible for looking at foreign interference and malfeasance in the system. We have US-like kinds of things, the Digital Forensics Lab, Atlantic Council, we have those that are looking at it, but they're not actually trying to control content. They're looking to see how we are being invaded and disrupted and distorted, which is a different kind of conversation. But I do think that in that space, and the ambassador knows me well in this, I have provocative views. I think we are, as free and open democratic societies, somehow, we were free and open democratic societies sort of in the 50s and 40s and 60s, and yet our CIA was highly manipulative in Russia, highly manipulative in Eastern Europe, highly manipulative in Latin America. And what is missing in the world of misinformation and disinformation is deterrence. The other side, the other major players, both private sector, non-state actors, and state actors, are not being penalized, are not paying very, very few costs, in my view, for the malfeasance they're creating in democracies. And as you see populism rising, what is populism? Populism essentially is a deep form of national narcissism. It releases a kind of jingoistic, often racist, often self-indulgent views. If any populists out there, happy to talk to you about it. Now, I'll bring you back. But I mean, the big thing is that, you know, with rising populism and rising, I am a nationalist, but I'm not of the sort that wants to reject and have great disregard for the international order or for other societies, etc. And as populism is rising, the flames that are coming out of some of the foreign manipulation are antagonizing and driving that forward. I think that is going to continue and get worse and continue to destroy the credibility and it's going to erode the status of other media. And you're going to find in the filter bubbles that are created more and more people that are seduced and attracted into these hives of thinking. That is a real problem. And that's not something that's happening organically in our societies. It's being driven. And until you can create pain for the perpetrators of this, I don't know why we're not sharing lots of information that we have on Vladimir Putin or on Xi Jinping or on, you know, various other players in this space, then I think that is going to be an increasing problem. So we were at a dinner, I won't tell who we were with, but somebody said, wow, Steve, you're first strike Steve. Happened to be a very senior US government officials at Mariangela's home. But I do think that in this space, and I'll bring it to a close here pretty quickly, it's not all kumbaya, it's not all feel good. I admire so tremendously the journalists and commentators that we're going to have on stage right now. I love them all. But I think that the dark side of this is something we need to think a lot more about. I endorse something far more aggressive out there because I see our societies being picked apart and driven apart, and the trend is not good. And I think the only way to do it, and I've talked to people at the National Security Agency, U.S. Cyber Command, they said the capacity exists for us to be much more aggressive, and we're just holding ourselves back because of the perceived. If we're like promoting the internet, promoting digital world as a place that's free and not manipulated, then how can we do that as the United States of America? And I said, well, we used to do it, and I'd be fine with that again. So let me stop there, but thank you very much for sharing some thoughts. Hopefully, I like to organize my thoughts around provocations, so this was designed to help provoke a debate. I may disagree with some of the things I said next week, so okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. And now I invite our panel to take their seats, Steve included. In the meantime, let me actually run a very small survey in the room to see where we are in terms of digital diplomacy and social media. Since Steve mentioned TikTok, how many of you are on TikTok? Raise your hands. How many on Instagram? Much larger number. Facebook, YouTube, X. How many have quit X recently? Okay. How many are on Threads? Okay. What about Blue Sky? LinkedIn? Oh, wow. How many are on Substack or are subscribing to a Substack newsletter? And last one, how many listen to a podcast at least once a week? Oh, wow, that's a large number. Okay, so we have a little bit of a overview of what we are here in the room. Okay, our moderator today is Adrienne LaFrance, the executive editor of The Atlantic. She has written extensively about technology, social media platforms, big tech, and new advances in artificial intelligence and generative AI. She was previously a senior editor and staff writer at The Atlantic and the editor of theatlantic.com. Leah Haberman is a digital rock star and an inspiring creator, economy, and digital marketing expert. She teaches social media marketing and influencer marketing at UCLA Extension, and she's the author and founder of ICYMI, in case you missed it, a popular weekly newsletter on Substack and LinkedIn. Leah was also one of the 100 creator economy experts invited to the first ever White House Creator Economy Summits this past summer. Elise Labott is the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and an adjunct professor at American University School of International Service. She's the founder of Zivi, that Steve actually mentioned, a nonprofit platform that engages youth and political and global issues. And she writes a popular Substack newsletter, Cosmopolitics. Elise, who was previously at CNN, is not new to our digital diplomacy series. She moderated a panel on the role of tech and the SDGs, featuring UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed here at the embassy. Aaron Parnas has been mentioned quite a bit, is also not new to our embassy, and he has participated to several of our roundtables on technology diplomacy. Aaron is one of the top political creators on TikTok with over 1.2 million followers on the platform and over, I believe, 60 million likes. He was one of the 30 creators selected by NATO and the US Department of State to participate in the recent NATO summit here in Washington. And then connected via video, we have Gianni Riotta. Grazie Gianni, I know it's really late there in Italy. Gianni is an oracle when it comes to the intersection of technology, journalism, and politics. He was one of the very first panelists to speak at our digital diplomacy series very early on. He's a visiting professor at Princeton University, specializing in digital humanities, machine writing, social history, and visual history of Italy. Since 2018, he has been directing the Master of Journalism and Multimedia Communications at the Data Lab Center at LUISS University in Rome, where he coordinates the Italian Digital Media Observatory. And last but not least, Steve Clements, who I introduced before. Thank you guys for being here today. I also want to thank all our interns that are here and helping us tonight. Ilaria Di Paola, Marcella Casagrande, Anna Carla Stucchi, Enrica Fonfulla. Thank you very much. Adrienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Make sure that's on. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, Ambassador, for having us, and thank you to everyone for being here, especially our panelists. I'll mention a few housekeeping notes. One is that we will, at the end, have time for your questions. So be thinking about them. I'll remind you again before we get to that point, but eager to hear what all of you are thinking about. Gianni, we will try to get to you and make you feel as included as possible. So just bear with us, but we see you up there. And then finally, just looking at all of the hands raised for every platforms, I feel like maybe we should all just go outside and go for a walk and be with nature and not on the internet. But let me start. Oh, and one final thing is Steve is going to be leaving us a little bit early. So when you see him leave, just assume that I've said something that's offended him terribly. Wonderful. I'm going to start with something a bit newsy, just because of all of the discussion about TikTok and a possible TikTok ban, and wanted to just kind of do a round robin and hear from you all, and then I'll tweak the question slightly for Gianni in Italy. What do you think is going to happen, and do you think that TikTok should be banned? Are we starting?
We'll
here?
start with you.
Starting
Yeah.
with me.
Okay. Do I think it should be banned? I don't know. I do want to rip the Band-Aid off though, and I think we need to move forward, either ban it or don't ban it, but we need to come to some sort of consensus. I think for creators, for brands that market on TikTok, as an information source, like something needs to happen. I do think that Instagram stands to be the biggest winner. I've been monitoring the chatter since Friday. It seems like the news has intensified since then. And based on what I see creators talking about, it seems like Instagram is going to be the alternative. I think YouTube is really viable too, but I think there's a bigger barrier to YouTube just because long form content tends to be intimidating to creators. So I think creators would be better served on YouTube, but I think a lot of people are going to move or focus on Instagram.
How about you?
I think it's interesting what Leah said, because we all started kind of on Instagram, then TikTok came and we all went to TikTok, and then now we're going back again. I think there's, with all the focus in the international diplomacy world on China, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from the incoming Trump administration to do something. And so I think we might see action kind of pretty soon. I think that's not really the question though. And I was just talking about this with Aaron earlier. What's the next TikTok? What's the next? It can't just be Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and that's it. And we say if one goes away, then the other goes away. Then maybe one will go bankrupt and then we're left just with one. I mean, I think that we need to keep looking at innovation. I think we need to keep looking at, what is going to be the other technologies that can help us along. And I should say, Andreas and Ambassador, thank you so much for having me. As Andreas said, I was an early kind of guest and moderator of this digital diplomacy series. And I think it's one of the best forums here in Washington that's really talking about these type of issues, and also not just talking about them in like the kind of policy spaces, but it's talking about it with real people. And we see so many young people in the room. And I think that's what's really exciting. So thanks.
How about for you with your bajillion TikTok followers?
Yeah.
Do I think TikTok should be banned? I think the answer is it depends.
Hmm.
I think the federal government has not done a good enough job to date to tell the public what the actual national security concerns are with the app. We hear a lot about how it's big, bad China, but we don't know why. So, to the extent that the federal government and Congress could do more to tell creators and tell folks on TikTok what's wrong with it, if there are legitimate national security concerns, then yes, something needs to be done, whether it's a ban, whether it's a divestiture or something else.
Or a
But-
sale.
Or a sale. But ultimately, it's up to the federal government to assuage the concerns. Now, I will say with the one caveat that TikTok, unlike any other social media platform, has really changed lives. There are over 170 million active users in America on TikTok, many of which are small businesses that literally make a living because they either sell products on TikTok or because they're getting paid through the TikTok Creator Fund. And I think that when you do away with a platform like that, unlike Instagram, unlike Facebook, you lose a lot of people will go out of business. A lot of people will have to pivot back to their quote unquote day jobs that they had before the pandemic in 2020. So I think it's a very it's a much greater calculation than just do we ban TikTok or not. It's really how we're impacting hundreds of millions of people around the country.
Steve, how about you? And then we'll go to Johnny. But I'm going to ask.
I'm
the
very
following-
opposed to the way we're talking about TikTok and banning it. We're demonizing a company. We're not talking about standards and rules that we care about in a transparent and understandable way for the American public. You can lay out something as a public or national security threat, but the way you approach that is not by banning a company or a brand or a process, but coming in and saying, what are the requirements for operating in the United States for any company? Give that company an opportunity to transform itself. Other companies can do that. That's not what has happened. TikTok is, essentially the champion that is in this space right now. And so the worry they have is that in times of conflict, algorithms can be released. What essentially may have just happened in Romania is what their bigger fear is. Now that was a problem where TikTok, if it was allowing the non-tagging of political ads for one person while everyone else was tagged and controlled within that very widespread Romanian presidential system, then they weren't living up to the laws and standards. So that's what I think is happening. You end up opening a Pandora's box between China and the United States and other nations if you go out and ban single companies like this. And that's what this approach and legislation has done. I'll tell people we have $750 billion of bilateral trade with China, and it's going to be a tough divorce if this is the way we're going to be doing it. And it will probably lead the United States into a serious kind of depression if we were to kind of go. China is already beginning to ban rare earth salts, et cetera, things that we need to run our economy. So I am worried that it's being very badly managed for short-term political gains.
Well, and we should go back to the question of political targeting because we know other US platforms do that kind of thing already. I know you had a point, but let me go to Johnny quickly. I'd love to hear your perspective from Italy, particularly because the United States tends to approach regulation, certainly, but also other aspects of how we think about social media and free speech differently than some other democracies. And so I'm curious from your perspective, first of all, the attitude toward TikTok there, and then sort of how you see things playing out here, watching from there.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Ambassador Zappia. She's a true leader, and to Andrea, she's a true pioneer about all these issues. I'm impressed because my students at Princeton and my students here in Rome at the Lewis School of Journalism, they react exactly the same way about TikTok. I've seen students, I'm talking about college students, undergrad, crying both at Princeton and both here in Rome because TikTok could be banned. Others crying because they spend too much time on TikTok. So clearly, don't ask me why, but clearly in the generation that is under 22, under 25, there is a need for TikTok. You saw the impact of TikTok on the American election a few days ago, and this is going to stay. So there is a need for short content, shoot it on a volley very fast. And so even if you ban TikTok, somebody else will feel the need, okay? Don't ask me why there is this need. And when it comes, so it's not very, it doesn't matter to be pro or against the ban on TikTok, but the need for that kind of content will stay with the younger generation, and somebody else will fulfill it. What I'm very, very worried about, both here in Europe and the United States, is about the platforms, because we tried to regulate platforms in Europe. I was part of the original commission that was supposed to regulate the platforms, and we failed. The Digital Service Act, the AI Act, the GDPR, all the the digital laws that the European Union tried to provide did a lot of work on paper, but when you see the real impact on the fight on disinformation, on the regulation on the platforms, or access to data for research that the platforms grant, we did achieve very, very, very little. And I don't know what will happen with the new Trump administration, but I see the platforms gaining posture and becoming bigger and bigger. And we'll
Well, and
see
it's
what
certainly-
Mr. Musk will do
Yeah.
for us.
And I'm sorry to cut you off. I was going to say, it's certainly telling that the richest man in the world and the incoming president both own their own social platforms. So there's a
I
signal
agree.
there.
I agree.
Let's go. You mentioned the youth, which I would, and the young people who've joined us today. Thank you so much for that. I want to put Aaron on the spot as the resident young person on the panel, with apologies to everyone else here, to talk a little bit about your own, why you started TikToking in the first place, but also, I don't want to just focus on TikTok. I'd love to hear you kind of talk through, even just anecdotally, observations from your own friend group, like how are people consuming news, and what do you think those of us who've been around a bit longer are missing from the shift that's taken place?
Yeah, for sure. So I started on TikTok back in 2022, and it was primarily because I felt as though that there weren't enough young people in legacy media on television. And a lot of people that were my age at the time, I was 23, now I'm 25, wanted to consume news from people who looked like them, who spoke like them. And they just weren't seeing that on MSNBC or Fox or CNN. So I opened up a Twitter or a TikTok account in February of 2022 and started doing a lot of work around what was happening in Ukraine at the time. I had family in Kiev when Russia invaded. And I felt also as though that mainstream media wasn't necessarily providing accurate, timely updates as fast as I wanted it. So I would hear things from my uncle in Kiev, and I would make a TikTok about it. And it instantly went viral. And within a week, I had over 1 million followers. And so I just continued doing that work, whether it was the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in between Israel, Gaza, now the political sphere here in the United States. I just feel as though that there is a void, and I'm there to fill it. Now, I think Steve mentioned something when he was speaking earlier about how back in 2004 you were in conflict with the mainstream media. I don't consider myself or other creators on TikTok in conflict with the mainstream media, because I feel as though my audience doesn't watch mainstream media. So there's no competition. And I think that even now, young people want to hear news in short form. No one has the attention span to listen for more than a minute, 2 minutes. And that's why all my videos, maybe a minute and 20 seconds max. And I think that it's filling a void, and I'm glad to be able to do it.
So this will sound like a silly question, but what do you do for things that require more than 1 minute and 20 seconds of complexity?
Yeah, so my day job, I'm a lawyer by day,
Right.
and I feel as though there are very few things that actually require more than 1 minute and 20 seconds of complexity. I think everything can really be dumbed down in a quick, easy way. And if folks want to do more digging and investigative research and all that, they can go do that on their own. That's not what my platform is for.
Yeah. Elise, I want to go to you for a second. You've talked before about your concern that because of the changes in media, and particularly short form, the sort of gravitation toward short form, that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that concerns over sort of thinning of understanding of foreign affairs. Is that mainly a misinformation concern? Is it a, talk to us about sort of what drives your concerns there?
Okay, well, I think my concern started, and before I go on, I just want to kind of bow down to Aaron, because what he's been doing is really along the lines of what we're trying to do with various young contributors, help people. I felt it came out of COVID really. And, I was on all these, intellectual chat rooms about how can we aid in COVID recovery. And I was saying, you know what? You can aid in COVID recovery by having a conversation about what the post-COVID world looks like. And you know who needs to be at the center of that conversation? Young people, because they've been disproportionately affected. They don't have a voice in the, issues shaping their future. And they are tuning out of mainstream media. And I think mainstream media covers youth and young people and their concerns like a monkey in a zoo, like, oh, that Gen Z person said X, but not bringing them in to the media conversation. And so that's why I started Zivvy News, which is really just, news by young people for young people about the issues that concern them about their future. I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations now, and on a larger kind of global sense, I'm really concerned about how young people are getting their news about global affairs. I'm concerned about all issues, but global affairs in particular. And I think we saw it after October 7th when there was all these protests. And, I don't have anything against, young people protesting. And in fact, I think it's great. These young generations have a lot of passion and a lot of activism that they want to do. But I think you also need to have that context and that nuance. And like, I think when you see people saying like, oh, that bin Laden is a genius, or, from the river to the sea, and they don't know what river and they don't know what sea, that concerns me. And that, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the council, wanted to put my project forward for the fellowship, is because that's a national security issue. What does that say? If you have a young, new generation coming up of young people that don't think America's a force for good in the world, that think, terrorism is the answer, that, don't want to serve in the military, that's going to have a lot of implications about our future foreign policy leaders, our, people in the military, and America's foreign policy and role in the world. So I'm concerned that through the algorithms, young people are getting news, confirmation bias, things that they want. Aaron, again, I think his videos are amazing. He does his homework. He's not just like mouthing off like, oh, this is what I think. Like, his uncle may tell him something, but then he's kind of cross-checking that with his sources about what he knows. So, I don't know what you're, train, you said you have a day job as a lawyer, but like he puts a lot of journalistic, muscle behind it. And most young people are not doing that. And they're getting that it's not even news. It's just kind of infotainment, and it's biased and it's thin and it doesn't have any context or any history. And I think we really need to do something to inoculate young people and help them give them some armor, so they want to get that context and that nuance, and they have a little bit of, before they have that emotional response through social media, that they're able to say, let me dig a little deeper, because Aaron is right. They don't have a lot of time, but they know when something's wrong. And right now they're not taking that second step and checking.
Well, and to be fair to the young people, I think you see not young people also falling prey to,
Oh, I mean,
so-
I feel like those generations, and unfortunately, have kind of been lost.
Right.
And so I'm focusing on like young people coming up, because they're going to be the future leaders of the world. And they're not saying, oh, Dad, I'm 18, time for my New York Times subscription. We need to
Right.
meet them where they are, I think.
Atlantic subscription, you mean?
Yes.
Of course.
Yes.
I want to go back to, algorithms and a lot of what you just said, but first let's talk, you both have alluded to sort of our collective waning attention. And I think that's such an important sort of cultural piece of this. And I'd love, Leah, to hear from you about, you're advising people all the time about how to grow their audiences and how to get their messages across. And I'm curious to hear from you sort of when what you've noticed works engagement wise. I ask not only because I'm curious sort of how you see the internet changing at a time where it is changing really dramatically, but also because I think it gives insight into how various algorithms are weighted toward snap reactions, emotion, anger, et cetera. And so just walk us through sort of what you see and what advice you give.
Yes, just to add one thought, just to
Please.
this idea of like context or substance. I think it doesn't necessarily mean, and I think everybody's saying this, it doesn't necessarily mean going long, but it does. I think we need to arm young people with media literacy skills and doing
Civics, media literacy. totally.
lateral research and
Yes,
fact checking.
yes,
And so I
yes.
think it's not necessarily about shoving more information at people or writing longer, recording longer videos, but I think it's about training people very early on to
Absolutely.
understand like who is this message coming from? Who does it benefit? Who is not in this message? How could this be misperceived, and being a little bit more critical. Okay, so sorry to pivot to the question that you actually asked me in terms of like it's about what platforms people are using, you think,
Or more sort of what do you find when you look across the wild internet and various platforms and you see the things that tend to go viral or draw the most attention? What things do you find in common? And sort of what does that reveal about how we deal with the problems that can come from this informational environment?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is that like outrage or shock value obviously is going to tend to go viral. And it's certainly a problem that needs to be addressed. And it's something that we do want to be cautious about and, think about the content that you're putting out there and, whether or not you're kind of leveraging or trading on that shock value to go viral. But you also see other types of content perform really well, content that's relatable, content that's shareable. Like that's a huge thing. Meta and Instagram, the head of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, has been talking about that for about 2 years now, talking about how young people, everyone, but mostly young people, are going to stories and DMs on Instagram. So going into private spaces. And what they're doing there is they're sharing content. They're not necessarily posting content to the feed. They're finding content from creators. They're finding content from, spokespeople. They're finding content from brands, and they're sending it to each other. And so thinking about what is the motivation for somebody to share this piece of content? How does it reflect on them? The New York Times did a really, really good study that still holds, 2011. If you look it up, New York Times, The Psychology of Sharing. Sorry, it wasn't The Atlantic.
It's okay.
But the New York Times Psychology of Sharing, they wrote something in 2011 which still stands. And they talked about why people share: to inform each other, to amuse each other, to strengthen the ties and bonds of their relationship. And a lot of it is about how that content reflects on them. So always thinking about, if somebody passes this on to their friends, family, followers, it's really about, how does this content reflect on me? What will other people think of me when I share this content? And so I think that's a huge thing that we need to be thinking about, especially as Gen Z and a lot of generations at this point tend to be going into these closed spaces, DMs, stories. It's very hard to penetrate if you're trying to talk to somebody or share a message, to get into these private spaces.
We're actually getting near our question portion, so have your questions in mind. Let me go to Johnny first. So I want to touch on AI at least a little bit before we go forward, just because we've all noticed this as users of the internet. The internet is just really dramatically changing. It's not just X, although that's a popular example. You see sort of the LLMification of search platforms like Google. And I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier, Johnny, your concern over not having gotten regulation right in the social platform space. And the ambassador before mentioned the AI as this multiplier. And I wonder how you're thinking about our readiness as democratic societies, the world generally, for that multiplier to really, and it's there to some extent already, but to really take hold of our informational spaces. How should we be thinking about that, and how to prepare as individuals and as societies?
Thanks very much for the question. I am mainstream as it comes because my dad was a journalist and my daughter is a journalist, as it was my brother. And I've even written for The Atlantic an article asking if Donald Trump was really a fascist or not. I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So when I show up, people say, mainstream. But I think that Aaron is right. And the real challenge is that we got to produce quality information on the format that younger people decided to elect as their favorite format. If you ask me how to produce that, I don't know. But you know, many years ago, I wrote my dissertation at Columbia Journalism School on artificial intelligence. And my dad would ask me, how come you've been dealing with this artificial intelligence stuff so early on? And you are the only one that didn't make any money out of it. And so, you know, I think that we reporters are very good at, you know, finding the real new issues, but then not so good on building on them. So the challenge is to find a way to engage the younger generation on their own, but where we are not, you know, going to kowtow to them is that disinformation is bad, and violence and hatred online is bad. And even what Bezos wrote on his answer to Trump and to his own journalist is wrong. Because if traditional media is not so fashionable today, it's not because they are bad, they are excellent. It's because there is a lack of trust in the general societies. And, you know, I run, and I will finish with this. I ran here in Rome and researched for the Vatican on disinformation against the Pope. And I was an altar boy as a young boy. And then when we had to go to the cardinals and deliver the results of the research, I was ashamed because 95% of this information on the Pope comes from established Catholic sources. So, you know, there is a lack of trust, and now to rebuild the trust is something beyond my pay grade, but that's what we are working on, rebuilding trust.
Right. And I think, I mean, that's an excellent point. Clearly, mainstream or legacy media has an issue with trust. At the same time, journalists are also under constant attack from politicians trying to discredit them. And we see, you know, authoritarianism rising around the world at the same time. So that's a real factor. Let me ask one more question, then I'll start going to you all. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and we actually have one of our staff writers, Helen Lewis, wrote a smart essay about this, is this question of, you know, mainstream media is a term that is sort of bandied about but ill-defined. And my colleague Helen makes the argument that we should start acknowledging that these newer sources really are the mainstream media, in part because they are the ones being consumed. So like Joe Rogan is a easy example, like massive audience, massive scale. Why are we not calling him mainstream media if that is where the people are now getting their information? Not just to pick on Joe Rogan, but you know, are you the mainstream media as someone with a huge TikTok audience? But I mean, it's a real question of definitions, and I'm curious how, Aaron, maybe I'll start with you since I've just picked on you, but how you define that. Thank you. I've offended Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think mainstream media and legacy media are two different terms.
Mm-hmm.
I think legacy media is the old guard, the MSNBCs, the Fox Newses, the ones that have been around, the New York Times, the ones that have been around for a long time. I think mainstream is whoever is it in the moment. So right now, I mean, I think it depends on, yeah, I would categorize Joe Rogan as mainstream. But I really think everyone's definition of legacy and mainstream is different, but it all just sounds like consultant speak to me, honestly. Like,
Fair.
just you watch who you want to watch at the end of the day.
Right. Let's go to the audience. Who has questions? Yes. I saw you first. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Right here. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Feldman. Thanks so much. I had a question. So what I'm hearing triggers me to think of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think what I'm hearing is a lot of the content that people are consuming in the new mainstream media is thinking fast. It's lizard brain. And that is the secret to going viral to some degree. And the policy question is, at least in the EU, there are some regulations that are starting to open up the black box of algorithms. And as that becomes possible, are there things that governments or civil society can do to tweak those algorithms so that in however many seconds we're dealing with, the audience is shifted to thinking slow and making exactly those decisions that you were talking about of, oh, is this accurate? Do I need to look into it more in depth? Thank you.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. I'm as an American who's obsessed with free speech and free press, I get really nervous about the idea of the government tinkering with algorithms because I see algorithms as editorial decision making, even if by a robot designed or programmed by a human. And so I get really nervous about regulation for that reason. But at least I'm curious what I mean, you've thought about this a lot.
I have thought about it, and I think you make a good point. I'm very ambivalent about algorithms because I think we've done enough studies, and the Surgeon General came out and said like a lot of these algorithms are kind of designed to spark emotion, maybe to spark outrage, to get that dopamine hit. And I think Leah said something really important. It's about media literacy. Yes, what Steve said early, we need to work with the media companies. There needs to be an incentive for these algorithms to be a little bit healthier, right? That kind of giving someone a balanced diet of news can be lucrative, right? That's how we work with them. But how does government and how does civil society work on the biggest problem? I think it's media literacy. I think we need to take more we are all talking about the algorithms and the platforms. We need to take more responsibility for what we're consuming. And I had this great I do some focus groups with young people to, talk about what they're looking for in media. And they said some interesting things. And these were, people at, some of the, very educated Ivy League, whatever. And they said, yes, I I look at something, I don't even know if it's true, but I'll share it because my friend shared it. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. I want to be in the club of people sharing it, and we all want to be we want to be in that inside space sharing it. And after a while, it almost doesn't matter whether it's actually true or it's not, because it becomes true to me. Right. And so I forgot who said it, but like, when you look at like, when anything could be true, nothing is true. And so I think that's where we really need to look at this media literacy, and then also think about how do we incentivize the platforms to do it. We can't regulate them to, it's not going to work that way. I think it needs to be a business decision for them, and then they'll want to do it.
Well, and one challenge too is, one of the ideas that I've heard about how to handle algorithms that I actually think is like at least good enough to consider is the idea of throttling something. So, you're not going to have Facebook look at every piece of content published and make sure it's true. Like that's not going to happen. That's not the scale at which they're operating. But they could have a program that decides, like, if something goes massively viral within seconds and is ricocheting around the globe, let's throttle it until someone can look at it. That's not aligned with their business interests, though. So
That'll never happen.
right, exactly.
They
So
just said they were going to cut back on moderation. so-
exactly, yeah. So
It's also not lucrative. Like, I'll just talk about my own content. Like, this is funny. I did this story on the importance of fact checking
love it.
in the Middle East on the October 7th, right? And TikTok banned it because they said it was misinformation,
Oh my
where I
God.
was actually showing an example of misinformation.
You should write about that. It's like a
I-
snake
I-
eating
I-
tail.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's I'd be interested to
But-
know like how you get around kind of, you're doing a lot of things that are kind of showing what's really going on.
Mhm.
When you show the example of what is wrong,
Mhm.
are you penalized by that?
Not really. I mean, okay, so I think it depends.
He has so many followers now that
So
they can't control him anyway.
So what many people actually don't know was when I first went viral back in 2022 and got to 1 million followers and whatnot, within 9 months, my account was permanently banned. And I never got that account back. It was mass reported by Russian trolls because I was doing a lot of pro-Ukraine content. And now I built it back up, doing other content to over 1 million followers again. But I was banned. I never got that account back. So I was penalized. I will say that in the past year or so, I think TikTok has been a little more lenient, I guess. I haven't been penalized really at all. But I know a lot of creators who are penalized based on political leanings, based on what they're talking about. So listen, everyone talks about the algorithm and stuff. It boils down to one thing for me. I think if your content is good and people want to watch it, the algorithm will push it. And create good content, you'll go viral. That's all it is.
It's also, I mean, we've been talking about TikTok a lot, but it's not the only
Yeah.
platform.
Of
Like
course.
Yeah.
YouTube
Instagram
is,
does the same thing though.
Instagram does, sure, they
Right.
do the same thing, but I'm just saying like Gen Z is not just on
Right,
TikTok. I
no.
think they're on Snapchat,
Yep.
they're on YouTube
Now
a lot.
Twitch a lot
Um,
now.
Sure, you might be on Twitch, you might be on Roblox, you might be on Reddit.
Yep.
So I think it's, yeah, really thinking beyond just TikTok.
Go ahead, yes. And then I'll go to the back of the room soon. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I'm the president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. I can't, it may sound kind of quaint that there was a time that I still remember, not that long ago, in which we used to have as a society shared truth. We had nice middle-aged gentlemen who, officiated on the evening news. You remember some of you, John Chancellor, David Brinkley, Peter Jennings,
Edward.
and of course, Walter Cronkite, who used to end all of his broadcasts saying, and that's the way it is. And if it wasn't the Cronkite show, can bet the house, it's true. We lost that completely. That's gone, never to come back. And this is a tragedy. But my point, beyond saying the obvious, that we can have in this country, but in other countries as well, coexisting opposite versions of events. This happened. No, it didn't happen. It was the opposite event. This good guys, no bad guys, with absolutely no possibility of reconciliation. And fact checking and doing your sort doesn't work. People believe their own biases, and that's the way it is. But let me just bring back the obvious, and you touched upon it earlier. My real concern, as mostly a consumer, I'm also a producer, but mostly a consumer of information, is the revolution that you touched upon and that is on us and completely uncontrollable. Because if we have a problem now, think about when artificial intelligence really gears up. As you know, electricity consumption in the United States is going to increase by 300–400% in the next few years on account of AI data centers, okay? NVIDIA, which was a company nobody knew about, is now one of the most valuable companies in the world. We all know this. What we don't quite appreciate is that artificial intelligence never sleeps, never takes a holiday, never takes a nap, it doesn't get sick, and there will be millions of things produced that we as consumers, as users, and you as professionals, you will have no clue what that is.
I think you're right that the,
And so my question is,
yes.
how do we deal with this? Well, when I talk to people who work on artificial intelligence, and I am just a layperson, they say, you haven't seen anything yet. This is, and they give me examples of what things there are possible, which I find incredible. But just let's look at the impact. Elections in Georgia, elections in Moldova, elections in Romania, which was just mentioned. That's just a tiny, tiny, tiny little of what is happening in the hands of malicious actors. Imagine these malicious actors having tools at their disposal that produce millions of pieces of content.
I'm going to
All
cut you
of
off
them
just so
want-
we have time for other questions.
Yeah, so
I'm
what
just
what I'm
gonna-
asking you is, then
I'm gonna
This is-
go back to what Leah said, which I agree with 100%. I think again, like, at what point did it become like just habit that you get in the car and you put on your seatbelt because you don't want to die in a car crash? We have to push the idea of teaching people how to be responsible media consumers. If they want it, I mean, I think it needs to be taught in schools. I think it needs to be something, there was things we learned at sex education. It was so important. We had to have that class, or driver's education. We need
Well,
media education.
And to your point, for seatbelts, like it's education and
And now it's
regulation.
law, right?
Right. It's regulation as well, because otherwise nobody
Right.
would have
Right.
worn their seatbelts.
True.
But you essentially force them to.
Right.
Let's go, red sweater. Yes.
So Erin, I've seen some of your TikToks before. I don't know why I'm standing. I'll sit. I've seen you report from like the airplane bathroom. So you're very quick with it, which as a consumer, I get most of my news from TikTok now, I'll admit it. And I am curious about the comment sections of TikTok and how that can impact reporting because people's comments are biased, even if the video content isn't. And I think a lot of people, young people specifically, stopped reading or watching stuff from traditional legacy media like a Fox CNN because it felt so biased. And they found maybe that some people on TikTok weren't as biased. And sure, you can argue that the algorithm will be biased, but there are people like you where it does feel very factual. But how does a comment section kind of play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think I'll say everyone's biased. I'm biased. Everyone has their biases, and you could only do so much to get that out of what you do. But I will say the comment section. I don't read my comment section, and I don't read my comment section for my mental health because they're not all good comments. I think that the comment section on one of my TikTok videos is akin to the comment section on a WAPO opinion piece. It's the same thing. It's just public discourse. So I don't necessarily think it contributes to disinformation or the work that I do as much, just because instead of having a conversation via text, you're having a conversation in the comment section right now. So I think
But you know, how do you engage with your, like, you don't
So,
want to engage
yeah, so
through the comments?
the way I engage with my followers is I try to go live every night, and I'll answer questions with folks literally live. I'll bring them up, I'll talk to them, whether they agree with me or disagree with me or disagree with what I'm reporting, and I'll try to do that every night.
Well, yes. That's you. Yeah.
One thing I want to ask about is there seems to be a lot of discussion about meeting young people where they are, but I want to ask about making sure that young people want to consume news at all. A lot of discussion about making sure young people aren't eating junk food, but I'm seeing a lot of young people don't really want to eat at all. They don't see the need to it. And there's a certain degree of, you need to kind of swallow some bitterness as just being a responsible part of a citizen. You have to kind of do your homework to like find out information. So I'm wondering, how do you engage more people who don't even want to find any kind of news engagement whatsoever? For as many people who follow politically engaged TikToks, I would imagine exponentially more just don't follow any kind of political engagement at all on TikTok or what have you.
It's a great question. I mean, I'm going to sort of add on to your question because I'm curious what all of you think about this, but the concept of digital or media literacy has come up a lot. And I think there's some value to that, certainly. And maybe it is something that's like standard in school curriculum, but I also skeptically worry that that's not enough for the immensity of the problem we're all facing. And so I'm curious, I mean, maybe it's your point in the end, Aaron, that it's if you tell a good story and it's true, it's enough. I tend to think that about what we do at the Atlantic. Just do the best possible version of the thing you're trying to do, and it will work. But I'm curious what you all think. How do we get people to like?
I'm going to jump in and just say, well,
Yeah.
Dave Jorgensen from the Washington Post. I think that the Washington Post has done one of the best jobs of taking news and just making it very digestible and consumable. Anecdotally, I have a teenage son and he knows Dave Jorgensen of the Washington Post. Doesn't follow any other, he doesn't follow the Washington Post, doesn't follow news organizations, but he knows who Dave is. And he's like, oh, it's the funny TikTok guy that sometimes talks about news. And I think like there's a validity to reaching people in that way. And then the news about, I'm trying to think like, what's Liza Minnelli Outlives? Does anybody follow Liza Minnelli Outlives? Like a lot of people are getting like Pop Crave, Liza Minnelli Outlives. So there's like alternative sources. And I think we may be a little too hung up on like, it needs to come from this source to be valid and to be accurate and informational. And I think sometimes and this is what we're seeing is like the broadening of where we're getting our media and like what mainstream media is. So I think it's an opening and appreciation of news can come from a lot of different sources and be delivered in a lot of different formats.
And I mean, maybe we're getting too hung up on, I saw a headline and I put it in my queue to read it later. Are we too hung up on the word news? And just kind of more information, just being aware of what's going on in the world. And can that be done through like community? Can that be done through You know, we're talking about Roblox. People are on Roblox now and gaming, and can gaming be a way? Can we use VR? Can we use, you know, I was saying earlier, like what's the next, you know, how can we innovate to create more curious people, to be more curious about what's going on in the world? And to be honest, like for young people, like, and the post-COVID, and this is why I kind of started on this, it's pretty sad. Like, you know, student loans are, you know, they have student loans, they can't get a job, they were, you know, stuck at home for a long time. Like, you know, the news is bad, and they don't want to be quote unquote doom scrolling. So when saying, you know, can it be more entertaining? Yes, but can we also create more empathy for like what's going on in the world, and then create that curiosity? And then that doesn't have to be news. It just has to be kind of more, call it global awareness, or, you know, informational awareness. I mean, maybe we're all hung up on, you know, we don't need to know what's going on 24/7. As like a kind of former CNNer, I'm glad to not be knowing what's going on 24/7 now.
Over here, yes.
Thanks. My name's Massimo Calabresi. Great conversation, guys. Thank you. Personally, I'm a little less worried about what people think and what they say than what people do, and especially what governments do. So I wanted to ask you to address what you think the dangers at this moment of heightened anxiety about discourse and truth may lie in government responses, including here at home.
I mean, I think journalists right now have reason to be worried from, you know, there's an administration coming who has actively said that, you know, Trump says that he wants to seek retribution against his enemies, many of whom are journalists. And so I take that seriously, quite seriously. And then in terms of just, I do personally worry about, you know, the declining trust in media also means that people don't see a free press as a cornerstone of democracy, and further don't see it as their own right that they're also defending. It's not just this professional class, it's your own right to speak freely or publish freely. I get agitated by this topic. And then the other thing I worry about is the conflation of understanding in terms of, you know, cultural norms around free speech versus actual protection against government censorship. And both of those things are important to protect, but like, you know, when Elon Musk, for instance, to use the most obvious example, claims that he's creating a platform for free speech when it's in fact a platform for propaganda, you're misleading people about what free speech even is. So I don't know if other people have thoughts, but those are my
Yeah.
quick reactions.
I have one kind of comment, and it's a little on point, but a little off point. I think that we're like nowadays, folks who have been around for a long time in this space are kind of treating this age of media wrong. I'm 25 years old. I was telling Adrian before we got on this panel, the first presidential election I remember was 2016. I don't remember the Obama era. I definitely don't remember Bush. I remember Donald Trump winning in 2016. All I know and all my generation knows is Donald Trump and the past 8 years or so. So when you think about it like that, all we know about media is that we can't trust media, right? When you say media is the cornerstone of a free press is the cornerstone of our democracy, well, why? Right? And I believe it, but why should an average 18-year-old, 19-year-old believe it when they don't know any better? All they hear is the media is the enemy. So I think when we're talking about AI and when we're talking about reaching young people, whether they want to hear the news or not, I think you have to use the same tools these bad actors are using for good, right? For the same way you can use AI to send 1,000 misleading tweets about an election, you can send 1,000 accurate tweets about an
I
election.
want to ask you, can I ask you
Please.
a question?
Of course.
I think that the media, legacy media, and I don't include Massimo in that because I think he's one of the greatest journalists in Washington, and he knows that I think that. I'm not blowing smoke. I've told him many times. And really, there's been a lot of great journalism and a lot of great investigation on the Trump years. But I think by and large, a lot of media has absconded its responsibility to report. There's a difference between reporting and commentary and analysis and opinion. And I think that has been really conflated, and that is the greatest damage that we've done to ourselves. I like to say that Donald Trump injected a flesh-eating disease into the media and we destroyed ourselves from within because,
Very vivid.
well, I mean, you can't really find anybody that doesn't have an opinion, and it's on Trump. I mean, they did it a little bit with Obama and you had Fox News, but everybody felt that it was their just, job to, get the guy. And yes, you can, there just had to be a more sophisticated way of reporting on him. And yes, he, doesn't want any criticism, but we also didn't give much credit when there were a couple things that he did that maybe deserve credit. And I think that because he saw us as the enemy, we saw him as the enemy, and we took his bait. And so I hope that in the next administration, there could just be like a little bit more reporters or reporting fact and leave the analysis. I don't want to hear from any anchor on CNN or MSNBC or, well, I don't want to hear what they think. I just want them to give me the facts and let me decide. I know that's I think that's a Fox thing. But anyway, I just think we got to get back to that, Walter Cronkite of what we're saying, and that's what happened. And you make up your own mind.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think you will see a push toward more accountability journalism in the second term because it's desperately needed. So hopefully enough newsrooms are well resourced enough to carry on that mission. But I guess one, and then we'll go to another question, but one of the challenges with Trump is when you tell the truth about him, he doesn't like it.
That's fine, but we don't need to do it. We don't need to do it. So I agree, but we don't need to do it so gleefully. And we don't
Marty
need to
Baron
say,
has
we need
a
to roll
famous-
our eyes and, say he's fat or he's orange or any of those things.
Oh
like,
yeah, and reputable outlets don't do that. I don't think.
They do. And
Can I just say, as like,
Yeah.
to get us outside of the journalism conversation,
Yeah.
I think because there's so many people in government here, I think next year, the thing that I would think about is, and Aaron touched on this a little bit, but it's like finding people where they are. And that may not be, it could be legacy media showing up in unexpected places, but it could also just be people on Roblox, Substack. We haven't even talked about newsletters, which,
Right.
clearly two of us write newsletters up here. And I think that's the new blog is newsletters. Reddit, Pinterest, LinkedIn. We haven't even talked about LinkedIn, which is like having a huge resurgence, and their fastest growing demographic is Gen Z. So I think, there's certainly what you guys are saying has merit. I'm just saying
it's
that I
important
think
to bring it out.
there's
abroad.
also kind of like, if you're trying to get a message out there to people and that's your job and you're in comms, you
Yeah,
have
it's
now got to
important.
go out, and it's going to be harder. I think it's going to be more work because you've got to look for these like smaller communities, but they are out there and they are receptive to information. It's just going to be a little bit more effort than just putting something in a newspaper or on a TV show.
And I don't know if you were giving me a signal that Johnny has. Okay. We have time for one more question. Let's go to you. Yes.
Thank you so much to the Italian Embassy for having us. I'm Efrat Hostetler. I'm from the Embassy of Israel. And my question was related to education and regulation. So it's kind of two parts, sorry. The first is the solution to education regulation maybe in the recent news from Australia of banning social media for kids under 16? And then the second question is, how do you sort of go about that if even where kids are getting their sources? I don't know if it's still Wikipedia. I'm a dinosaur myself, but if Wikipedia is the source, that's already tainted too. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And thank you.
I'm very nervous about regulation, as I've mentioned. So let me go to Johnny, because I know we sort of started out with you talking about that. You must be tired over there as well. So,
No, it's fantastic, very, very interesting. I'm totally
what can we
skeptical
learn from
about.
Australia?
I'm
Sorry, go
totally skeptical about regulation, because recently we were at the Italian Parliament debating, banning the kids from, social media because they could get access to pornography. And I thought myself, as a Sicilian boy, when was the first time I saw a pornographic magazine? And it was like, it was very difficult. There was a lot of prohibition then, but then we get access to. So it's very interesting. I don't believe that, cutting off the kids would be very helpful. And, I'm thinking about that we have to be optimistic because, you know, distrust of the people was always there. When President Kennedy was killed, many Americans didn't believe the war report, the official version, and they didn't believe that President Kennedy was killed by Oswald. And this 1/3 of the Americans still don't believe it. So disinformation and mistrust of the you know, institutions was always there. And the interesting point is that we have to fight hard. I'm a big believer in journalism, but you know, journalism changed because American journalism before Watergate wasn't what was after Watergate, and before Kennedy wasn't what was before after Kennedy. And we have to change, and we have to fight to regain trust. But if you ask me, I'm totally optimistic because I think that in the long run, you know, truth beats, you know, lies hands down.
I love ending on an optimistic note, but I'm actually told we have time for one more question. So if someone wants, how about right here? Yes.
Thank you. I actually, again, would like to move away from the question. I think there's a prevailing thought within not only the young community, but the communities in general about the value of our data, and particularly where you have algorithms that are built on this data. You know, we have social media organizations that they monitor the retweets, the likes, how long you linger on a post, how much time you view that video. And this ties back into the conversations that we have around TikTok and that level of education. The average young person doesn't really care that their social security numbers online. It's very much kind of a thought that our lives are public, our information is public. Data leaks happen on average at least once a day. How can we convince young people to be a better steward of their personal data when it comes to these critical issues such as algorithms, the data that they have, as well as tying back into the conversation around TikTok and the data that they harvest?
I'm gonna push back on the notion, the underlying premise of your question, because I don't think it's just young people, and it's not just TikTok, right? Amazon tests 100 different ways of how the color of a button on their website to see what is pressed more than other things, right? Big companies have been doing what TikTok is doing for years. I mean, that's how they gain a competitive edge. So I think that we are in an age where me as a young person personally, I believe that my data and my information will be out there, and there is nothing that I can do to stop it. And it may be wrong, but that is what I believe, and I work within that worldview, and I work within those constraints. And I think a lot of other young people, like myself, believe that. And I do want to touch base on just the education policy question or the regulation question, which I think regulation of tech companies is not the answer. If you want education regulation, put civics in every classroom in America, right? Teach students, kindergartners, first graders, what the 3 branches of government are. My favorite thing to do as a lawyer, not as a TikToker, is to go into first grade classrooms and teach students what happens if a police officer comes up to you. What do you say?
That would be a good TikTok though, actually.
Yeah, but that's kind of
House rock for
Yeah.
the new generation.
Anyways.
We are out of time. Thank you all. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Johnny, for staying up so late and getting back.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Johnny, again. And please enjoy the cocktail reception outside. We have pizza, beer, and a little cheese from Italy.
I'm gonna miss that. I'm gonna miss that.
That was so fun.